Good afternoon. My name is Dominic Register. I'm a Programme Director at Salzburg Global Seminar, a not-for-profit organisation based in Austria, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the latest online edition of Qatar Foundation's Education City Speaker Series. Today we are focusing on one of the key issues facing the world as we look towards the new normal created by the COVID-19 pandemic, building the future of education and how we prepare young people for this new normal. This year, we've seen how education systems around the world have been forced to adapt, adjust and innovate as the coronavirus crisis has led to online, distance and blended learning models becoming a necessary norm. Education is often seen as a fairly conservative sector and one that is slow to reform, one of the reasons why so many school systems can be characterized as still operating on 19th century modalities. But since the start of the pandemic, we've seen fantastic creative responses, both digital and offline, from education institutions around the world. New priorities for education have emerged, in many cases with an emphasis on compassion and cooperation rather than competition. However, there will be more disruption to education ahead. This is also a moment of convergent crises: the pandemic, the climate crisis, the learning crisis that predates COVID-19, the mental health crisis among young people, intergenerational conflict, an escalation of the struggle for racial justice, and the realization that there is still so much to do to meet the Sustainable Development Goal targets. And there remains the question of equality of access to education. No part of the world has been untouched by COVID-19, and education is absolutely vital to countries everywhere being able to build back better or just rebuild. But with so many children being denied the chance to learn, are we, as a global community, aware of what we need to do to protect education in vulnerable societies and turn that awareness into action? This urgent need for action was highlighted last week through the United Nations International Day to Protect Education from Attack, which was proposed by Her Highness Sheikha Moza bint Nasser, the chairperson of Qatar Foundation and Education for All. And that makes it an opportune time for Qatar Foundation to bring together experts and youth advocates from around the world to discuss how, in a world reeling and recovering from COVID-19, we can make education more resilient, more disruptive, and more accessible to all. To give you some background, the Education City Speaker Series is a Qatar Foundation platform that provides people with an opportunity to hear from, learn about, and interact with thought leaders on the key topics facing our world. Today's event is presented in partnership with Education Above All and Qatar Foundation's World Innovation Summit for Education. And you can watch the discussion unfold and be part of it, either on Microsoft Teams or on Qatar Foundation's Facebook and YouTube channels. If you're watching on Microsoft Teams, there is a live translation and there are subtitles in English, Arabic, French, Spanish, and Italian. And if you want to post about this discussion on your social media channels, it would be great if you could use the hashtags EC Speaker Series, Unite to Protect, and Protect Education from Attack. We've got a fantastic lineup of panelists joining us today, and I'd now like to introduce them to all of you joining us from around the world. Dr. Jaime Saavedra is the Global Director for Education at the World Bank, and from 2013 to 2016 was Peru's Minister of Education, during a period when the performance of the country's education system improved significantly. Throughout his career, he has led groundbreaking work in areas such as poverty and inequality, employment and labour markets, and the economics of education, and he has held positions with international organisations and think tanks, as well as teaching and academic research roles. Jaime, we're delighted you can join us today. Jaime, you're muted, I'm sorry.
Well, great to be here, Dominic. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Dr. Hassan Rashid Al-Derem is the president of Qatar University, a role he has held since 2015. He has played a major role in advancing research activity, both within the university and across Qatar, and has just seen the university climb 90 places in the latest edition of the Times Higher Education World University Rankings. Hassan, welcome.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Nada Al-Nashif is the UN's Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights and has more than 30 years of experience within the UN ecosystem. Before taking up her current role, she was the Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences at UNESCO, where her portfolio focused on using knowledge to build more inclusive and sustainable societies. Nada, we're delighted to have you here with us.
A pleasure to be with you today. Thanks very much for having me. Thank you, Dominic.
Dr. Mamadou Dieng Balde is the Deputy Director within the Socioeconomic Inclusion Service, part of the Division of Resilience and Solutions at UNHCR, the UN's refugee agency. He oversees and supports its global programs on education, livelihoods, economic inclusion, and social protection. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today, Mamadou.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dominic. Great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. And Dr. Gita Murali is the CEO of Room to Read, an organization that has benefited almost 17 million children in 16 countries through its programs in literacy and girls' education. It focuses on bringing about systemic transformation within schools in low-income communities. Gita, welcome to the Education City Speaker Series.
Honored to join all of you for this important conversation. Thank you.
And bringing the perspective of youth to today's discussion is Obakeng Lesayane, a student and education activist from South Africa. He's the founder of EdConnect, an initiative that enhances access to education for underserved South African communities, through which he's supported thousands of out-of-school children back into school to continue their education. He now also has a grand goal of enrolling 1 million students in schools by 2025 through his initiative EdConnect. He is a global ambassador for Their World, a global children's education charity. Obakeng, delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much for the invite, and I'm really looking forward to engaging with everyone.
So the format this afternoon is I will ask each of them a maximum of 2 rounds of questions over the next 45 minutes, and we will then bring in questions from the audience. So please post these in the Q&A section on Teams or the chat section on Facebook or YouTube. And to our speakers, if you would like to respond to one another's questions or offer follow-up comments, then please feel free to jump in at any point. You'll need to raise your hand so our producer knows to key you up to speak. So we will now move to the first round of questions, and Hassan, I'd like to start with you if that's okay. So in terms of disruptive education and adapting to a new educational norm post-COVID-19, what do you believe needs to be considered? What are the lessons that we have learned during the pandemic, and what are the opportunities that have emerged to help shape the education field in the future?
Yes, thanks, Dominic. I think as the pandemic brings challenges, it also brings with it opportunities and great opportunities to test our theoretical models and means of what we are doing and how to do it in a much better way. I think the future of higher education will depend on whether this pandemic will be a chronic, or it is a single crisis, or it is a series of waves. And either direction of these 3 directions will present academic leaders with different challenges and options. And for academic leaders to deal with this or the future, the campus also will be either an online campus, a reopened campus, or a blended or high flex campus. As we all know, the role of IT will also become more dominant as data gathering and analysis become more important, as well as it will be also problematic at the same time. And gathering of these informations and data will be done through devices such as mobiles and others. But this also brings with it a challenge or the question of privacy issues and disclosure of information and data security. All of these challenges, higher academic or higher academicians and policymakers should think of. I think also the student experience will also have a great challenge as financial pressures are numerous upon the universities because of either the recession and the government spendings on issues related how to fight the pandemic, or as well as because of the unemployment and the families losing their jobs. So I guess and I think that less income students will have less chance to enter universities, and the melt of students will increase over time. This will also brings with it probably a closure of some campuses, and so there is a prediction, for example, in the US alone, probably around 100 campus might shut down. Okay, we will also may see a shift in majors and graduate degrees, and where the students would like to study in areas related to COVID related fields, and including whether it is in medicine or in public health and its related fields, or also would be, I think, experience the students will we will probably experience shift towards interest in business and economics because of the challenges that the governments and the communities will face. All of this should bring our attentions towards designing our curricula, where these new curricula should be responsive to the needs of the market. Technology trends also is something that should be of a concern for us, where robots, bots, whether it is retail, deliveries, or medical care, campus automation, video conferencing, as we are doing now, and new or more businesses enter the market, whether it is through telepresence, robots, virtual worlds, virtual reality headsets. All of this brings a challenge whether our campuses are accessible and whether there is a limitation for our campuses. So all of this, I think, in summary, I think our university, the university of the future, should be both resilient and agile for all of these changes, because we will see waves of changes in a much shorter period of time. The universities have to adapt fast and have to meet these challenges in a fast response.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that answer. You've given, I think, enough material for a season's worth of Education City Speaker Series conversations. And a lot of the themes that you brought up are ones that we're going to return to in a later part of this conversation. If I could turn to you now, Jaime, if that's okay. As well as your current role within the World Bank Group, you've been a Minister for Education and you've managed to bring about significant improvements in Peru's education system. Do you think that now, during the pandemic, potentially on the cusp of a global recession, is the right time to embark on significant education reforms? And can the pandemic provide us lessons for further reforms?
Thank you very much, Dominic. Can you hear me well? Look, thanks for the question. I think the reforms, I would say, are inevitable. And the key point is if we are going to be able to learn from the different lessons that this pandemic is leaving us. And I see lessons actually for many of the players of the education system. First of all, I think there's a huge lesson for parents, in the sense that now it's with these extended lockdowns that most countries have been living in. It's very clear for parents that there are really they have had a huge influence in the future of their children. That their role in terms of putting the right conditions for them to have the environment to have a good learning experience at home is absolutely critical. Now, many parents already had that internalized, but many not, right? And actually, it's even now part of public policy to make sure that all parents have that as support in order to be real guides of their teachers' education process. In an understanding that in the future we're going to be living in, there's going to be more of a continuum of the education process between the school and the home. Not only now in the transition when schools go back to when children go back to school, right? But we see that as part of the characteristics of the school of the future, a continuum of the learning process between the school and the home, hence a critical role for parents. But actually, the other lesson for parents and for society in general is a better understanding of the importance of the future. I think it's clear for all of us that technology is critical, but technology will never replace a teacher. Education is a social experience. And actually that social interaction is what children are still losing by not going back to school, even in those cases, not all, in which there is some effective remote learning, right? Still that social experience is been lost. And the social experience is about interaction with other peers, and it's about interaction with teacher. And actually the teacher as a coach, right, as a guide to the learning process, right, is absolutely central to the education system. And one thing that we need to now really internalize is that the successful education systems are those who really value the teacher profession. And hopefully that's something that we really get as a lesson of this pandemic, right? That we need to give the right social value to the teacher profession and give all the teachers all the professional development opportunities they need to be coaches, to be guides of the teaching process, of the teaching learning process, and to have the digital skills. And one final lesson, there are many lessons, but one final that I want to mention in this intervention is that, and this is for ministries of education, and authorities, we need to close the digital divide. True, technology will not replace the teacher. Technology is a fantastic complement to the teacher that can enhance his or her role. But we have been talking about the digital divide within countries for 20 years. Well, the digital divide was not closed. So today in low-income countries, only 10% of kids will have access to internet. 50% maybe in middle-income countries. So hence it has been much difficult, right, to have a resilient system because of the lack of having closed that digital divide before. So lessons for society, for ministries, for parents, and if we build upon those lessons, we can build a more equitable, more resilient, more effective system.
Fantastic, thank you very much. The role of parents is critical, isn't it, moving forward? And I think the appreciation that parents have of the skills that a teacher requires have gone up globally over the last 6 months. Nada, if we could turn to you, please. You've worked with underprivileged and marginalized groups around the world that are experiencing all kinds of different challenges. Could you tell us about the work you do with people who are displaced or persecuted or affected severely by COVID-19? And as UN Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, what is the High Commissioner for Human Rights doing at the moment to guarantee that every child gets his or her right to education?
Thanks very much again, Dominic, and this follows on from what my predecessors on this panel have said, underscoring first of all the universality of the right to education. As we just heard, education is not a human right in itself only, it's really an enabling right for all other human rights, and this is how we see it. It's indispensable. It's the primary vehicle by which economically and socially marginalized adults, young people, children, entire communities can lift themselves out of poverty and obtain the means to full realization of their potential and of their capacities. And I'm glad that we have both a representative of the younger generation to remind us of that later on today, and that we have among us also someone from UNHCR, because a large linchpin of our work is the collaborative effort across the UN system. Of course, we work with the World Bank as well, but we have seen how much these educational disruptions, whether from conflict or global crisis, such as the pandemic, have an overarching impact on children's lives and the future of entire communities, because precisely they compound other inequalities that have existed over time. And if you come from an indigenous community, if you come from a very specifically geographically isolated community, then we are factoring in multiple levels of isolation that are not really going to be overcome by anything so simple. So with our UN partners, working again under the leadership of UNESCO and UNICEF, with all the rest, of course, we are really looking at how to embed a human rights-based approach at the heart of conflict and prevention, but also recovery. There's been a big emphasis on how we can recover by building back better. I think we're going to come back to that later on in the conversation, but that will not work unless we put the most marginalized at the center of our efforts. And certainly the thing of participation is very important. the voices and the best interests of affected children, but entire communities. So their parents, their teachers, that entire community of learning and education has got to be reflected in policies and programs that are taken up. And two areas of work for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We are continuing to provide advisory services and technical assistance to governments, first of all, along with many others, in order that they are able to honor, first of all, articulate, but also honor, fulfill their obligations in terms of implementing human rights standards on the ground, and creating an environment that can be conducive to the realization of the right to education. Within the big envelope of economic, social, and cultural rights, we're really working to make sure that the budgets that are earmarked for education, and there's a huge disparity between what is said and what is done and what is actually implemented, of course. So we're working to track that the universal standards are upheld, that we can really continue to work on free universal primary education, that we can improve data collection, that we can make sure that advisory services for a rights-based approach are there. And this accountability mechanism is then a whole very important part. We have many special rapporteurs. These are independent experts who speak across the world on a range of issues, including we have a special rapporteur on the right to education. We have a committee on the rights of the child, a committee on economic, social, and cultural rights, and many independent human rights institutions on the ground that are there really to hold state parties accountable for the implementation of the right to education. I'll give one example from South Sudan, a country in transition, coming out of conflict, we hope, but we have a UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, and they are really working to look at this allocation of resources for the key economic and social sectors, particularly education, including, for example, recovering illicit funds from corrupt activities and realigning spending priorities in line with the aspirations of the population and particularly of young people and communities. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, and for reiterating the role that education has as an enabling human right that impacts on so many other rights. I know that that's a key concern for UNHCR as well, so it's a nice segue to Mamadou, please. So recently, UNHCR released a report titled Coming Together for Refugee Education, and that predicted that unless there was immediate and bold action taken by the international community to address the effects of COVID-19 on refugee education, the potential of millions of young refugees living in some of the world's most vulnerable communities will be further threatened. With half the world's refugee children, over 3.7 million children, already out of school, how do we need to come together to help them?
Thank you, Dominic. And let me really align myself with what has been said earlier, and maybe just share a few reflections as well as a number of recommendations that we believe will be contributing to making a difference. The reflection, pre-COVID already, we had quite a very bleak and dire situation for refugees' access to education. At primary level, only 77% of refugee youth who are eligible to access primary education accessed it, while if you compare them to their nationals, their peers really access it at 90% or more. That numbers really goes even further down when it comes to secondary education. So at secondary level, we have only 31% of refugee youth who are eligible to access it, who are able really to exercise that fundamental right. And there I have to say that most of the numbers, we are reaching 31% because of the large number of boys. So it means that girls are even much more in a different as well as a difficult situation. When you reach tertiary level, it's 3%. So 77%, 31%, and 3% primary, secondary, and tertiary. So these numbers are not good, but if you compare them to the progress that has been made the past 10 years, you will think that it is a progress. What is happening with COVID? All the gains that we have seen the past few years are being threatened with the closure of schools, with all the isolations that have been taken, with limited access to digital education. For example, we have in Lebanon, only out of 48,000 refugee families who were surveyed, half of them needed support to access digital education, distance learning education. In the refugee camps in Dadaab, only 3% of refugees were able to access digital education, while for the nationals it goes up to 11%. So really, I think the numbers are really painting these very difficult conditions for refugees, so they are excluded. Now, what are the measures we believe could be taken to really make a difference? Let me just propose three. The first one is really to have enabling and smart policies, inclusive policies by government. We have seen them in several parts of the world, government taking policies that are not excluding the refugees, but that are including them, looking at the needs of refugee girls, and these measures need to be supported. A second measure, really deriving from a very seminal decision taken by the UN General Assembly in 2018 through the Global Compact on Refugees, is the call for the international community to support the the large refugee hosting countries. And these are not really in the global north. They are mostly in low-income countries. They are really medium income countries, and these are the Jordans of the world, they are the Lebanons of the world, they are Uganda, Kenya, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Colombia, Peru. These are the countries that really are shouldering the biggest, I think the biggest burden with receiving, and the one that are exercising greater the solidarity that is required. So supporting these countries is the second measure. The third measure is really, I think, in the name of the report itself, it is coming together. I'm glad to have here, in addition to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, colleagues from the World Bank. We have seen the past few years development actors, right institutions, other international financial institutions, government, the private sector, education above all, money and private sector institutions, universities coming together. I think only that way will we be able to better support the families, the refugees, and the communities that are hosting them. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And the point you make about the digital divide being so much more acute for refugee communities speaks back to what Jaime was saying as well, and I think something we'll be returning to. Obakan, if we could turn to you, please. In 2018, Education Above All, who are one of our partners for this event, reached its goal of educating 10 million out-of-school children, and you have a similar goal of educating 1 million students by 2025. Could you tell us a bit about what inspired you to set that goal and how you plan to achieve it? You're muted, Obakan, I'm sorry.
Apologies for that. Thank you so much for the question. I think something that I have realized is that when you have systems that don't function, a single person that chooses to be active in those systems has so much power. And I think about my own personal story in 2012 when I got a scholarship to go to a fairly good high school that essentially allowed me opportunities such as being able to even have this conversation with you. That I think back to the power that scholarship had in my life and how it fundamentally changed the trajectory of my life, that I'm like, without it, I wouldn't be the hope that I am for my family. Without it, I wouldn't be the young, active person in my community that I am. That often we really downplay the importance of education, particularly across the African continent, where a lot of our grandmothers, a lot of our mothers have not had access to that have not had access to the quality education that we can now dream of today. So essentially, for me, I sat back, I was like, it's not enough that I am one in very few that have a chance to access this quality education in my community. What can I do to be able to pay, to like almost pay it forward, taking into account and thinking about the impact that education has had in my own personal life, that I can now dream of public service roles, of even president, even someday occupying some of the positions that some of my fellow panelists occupy today, that I can literally only dream of that only because of the type of quality education that I have received. And when I think about the type of work that I want to do in the next 5 years, it really boils down to about 3 levels. I think at a first level is that, it's at a policy level, building those inclusive, those smart policies that take into account how difficult problems may be. And because they are that difficult, solutions equally need to be integrated to be able to solve for the complexities within that problem. And secondly, is thinking about partnerships. That 1 million for me is a very scary number, that God forbid, that the only way that I can see it possible is through partnerships with people that are really thoughtful and people that are really committed to this type of work, of not just ensuring that young people can have access to quality education, but that young people can actually complete their educational path. Because what happens is that you can very easily bring in a very high number of young people into systems, but how do you ensure that completion rates are just as remarkable as the entry-level rates? And particularly like in crisis, that's when we see that a lot of young people tend to almost be like off grid. So how do we begin to work in that space? I think partnerships are almost critical, and one that is most closest to my heart is programs. I believe in the power that grassroots level programs have, that often what happens is, while like impact may be funded at a boardroom level, the impact really happens at a grassroots level. And it is felt there that, for me, what is most important, and something that I've seen, is that you have a lot of young people who say it is not enough that I have had access to this to this level of quality education, that I have to do the same thing for my community. Particularly as Gen Zs, I think we care more about the world, and we are just pressed for a much more equal world. And by virtue of that, many of us start initiatives in our home countries, start initiatives in our very off-grid environment. And a big part of that is we understand the power that we can be able to have, because systems at that level don't function. That's not a level at which you often find that a lot of these multinationals report at, right? That I'm like, when I go back home, for me, that is where I have to make sure that impact first starts, and impact can then extend beyond that. So my goal for 2025 is for the whole Southern African region, because I do know that our most of our problems are complex and nuanced, but really I believe that with very strong policy, with very strongly aligned partnerships and very grassroots level programs, we can easily reach that number and ensure that we not only enable access, but we enable young people to be able to complete their educational journeys.
Thank you so much for that, and fantastic that you can be so clear about the need for partnerships. There are obviously some very powerful potential allies both on this panel and watching us today. So best of luck with that ambition. And I think what you said about scholarship and opportunity being so important for early life chances will resonate very much with Dr. Geeta Murali as well. So Geeta, if I could turn to you for the final question in this first round. According to UNESCO, 250 million children worldwide are failing to acquire basic literary skills, and this has a huge and detrimental impact on their future prospects. Given that literacy is so vital to life, why do you believe that so many children are missing out on it?
Thanks so much, Dominique. I just want to say that a lot of what's been said resonates with us as an implementing organization, and I'm looking forward to talking about some of those themes as we move ahead. But in terms of your question, why are so many children missing out? Poverty and inequity are at play. They make quality education continue to be out of reach for millions of children around the world. And of course, the global pandemic is exacerbating that issue. We already had projections that prior to the pandemic showing that 1 in 6 children, adolescents, and youth were expected to be out of school. Only 6 in 10 young people would complete their secondary education. And so now with the pandemic, we have this added and enormous threat to already challenging circumstances. Estimates of 24 million children potentially not returning to school after the pandemic. So cumulative effects of the emergency are potentially huge. So how does this play out? Children are missing out on literacy development specifically, because even though we know that children will develop their literacy skills when they have access to books and reading materials, when they have trained and supported teachers who know how to teach, when they have opportunities to learn outside the classroom, when they have family and community members supporting learning, when education systems can assess learning and adjust to address learning needs, let alone the multi-sectoral support that needs to surround the child around good nutrition, a safe living environment, sanitation. Even though we know all of these things, there are still so many children who do not have access to reading materials at home, who are going to schools that do not have adequate books and learning materials in the classrooms, who are going to overcrowded classrooms with teachers who've not been trained or coached on teaching literacy. This is why Room to Read has been working on strengthening the supply and demand chains for high quality reading materials. We've been working with ministries of education to improve literacy curriculum, training and coaching early grade teachers. We have a long history of improving support to parents and community members to build the culture of reading outside of school. But we're not just focused on demonstrating the critical components of literacy development at the school level. We have to work at the nexus of the school and system to translate operational specifics into scalable solutions. And I mean really tactical things, translating scope and sequence into daily lesson plans, providing specific book lists, specific vendor lists to school districts. So given the specificity with which we have been implementing our programs in school communities, the onset of this pandemic, school closures, we had no choice but to systematically reshape our literacy interventions to meet children where they are and help them continue learning. And as Jaime had indicated, the digital divide was an important reality that would have kept children on our programs from learning if we did not act quickly. We know half of the students out of school worldwide don't have access to a household computer, 4 in 10 don't have internet access. Places where we work, 9 in 10 students are lacking internet access. So it makes it all the more important that we're offering low-tech, no-tech learning options in addition to any online resources. And for children who don't have access to internet technology or computers, smartphones, other devices, Room to Read's providing worksheets, books, other hard copy materials to keep children learning, alongside parental support by SMS messages or radio or television broadcast. And I can't emphasize that enough. We've talked a little bit about that continuum of learning from the classroom to the home now, and it is important for us to continue to be flexible in our ability to deliver this type of programming. So as we've taken to airwaves and created hybrid approaches, we've had to work with governments and public media stations to ensure scale, reaching millions of households. And for those who do have online access, we've also offered expansive libraries of books, now 1,000 so books in 21 languages via our digital platform, Literacy Cloud, as well as teacher training tools. But we have to be conscious of the environment these children are learning in now. We know this has been an unsettling and disruptive time for children. So we're also working with local authors and illustrators to create COVID-19 themed children book titles in 10 countries. Our diverse storybooks, literacy worksheets, they can be vehicles for children to discuss and process their feelings, develop strategies to promote resilience. And given our gender focus as well, we're able to leverage such materials for girls specifically with additional challenges to their education that have been brought on by the pandemic. So in the end, we're doing our best to ensure children don't miss out on strengthening their literacy skills in the midst of so many pressing issues. We're working to ensure childhood literacy specifically stays at the top of the agenda. And in my opinion, that's the only chance we have to create a generation of learners who will continue to solve the range of problems societies are bound to face in the coming years.
Thank you for that, and for weaving in so many of the themes that previous speakers had also brought out, and particularly I think the importance of resilience in education reform and moving forward, the importance of gender considerations and the risk around the digital divide. We're going to take a second round of questions to you all, if that's okay, but if I could ask you to be briefer in your responses so that we can then bring in questions from the audience. And there are some fantastic audience questions beginning to come through, so please continue to post them. But Jaime, if I could start with you for the second round. In the introduction, I talked a little bit about this, the pandemic is not a crisis in isolation. We are at a time of convergent crises. one of the challenges around that, is around the economics of education. And I wonder how much more challenging you think that's going to become in this new normal. And as a global community, what do we need to do to ensure that young people don't lose out on education because of a lack of investment?
Well, the first challenge is to try to answer that question in a couple of minutes. I just want to, before I emphasize the point that was made by Obakeng, that we need to worry a lot about the trajectories only, and not just by seeing and understanding if people are going to school. Let me give you an example. In Tanzania, not all children go to school at when they are 5 or 6, but of those who go to school in early primary, say of those 100 kids, only 50 will finish primary, only 30 will finish junior secondary, and only 6 or 7 will finish senior secondary, right? That is a tragedy, right? And that's precisely the point that Obakeng was saying, right? That we really need to worry about the trajectories and assure a full round of primary and secondary education. And we're extremely far from that, right? And before this pandemic, I'll go into your point, Dominic, before this pandemic, we were already living a learning crisis. We already had 258 million kids that should be in primary or secondary school and were not in school. And we already had 53% of learning poverty, meaning 53% of children who were not able to read and understand a simple text by age 10. Our calculations is that number could easily go up by 10 points, right? Just because of the extent of the closures that we already have had, right? And the very unequal remote learning experiences that children have had. Some have a good experience, have nothing, right? In terms of education stimulation. So this is posing a huge challenge on public budgets. Remember that this is an extraordinary crisis because for the first time, you have extended school closures, right? Which you have had in the past in countries because there have been strikes or political issues. You have had recessions in the past, right? Which has an impact on public budgets and the family possibilities to invest in education. But you have never had the two things at the same time and simultaneously in all countries in the world. So this is really an extraordinary crisis. The challenge is that we need to protect public budgets, right, in order to be able to continue investing in education in a context in which we were already investing in enough. And the key point is how to mobilize domestic resources to education. Remember, we're in a world of huge inequalities. In average OECD countries spends, say, $7,000 per student. A Latin American country, say Colombia, will be spending $1,500 per student per year. Nigeria spends $200 per student per year, right? So the differences are immense. The challenges were already huge, right? Particularly in poor and middle income countries in terms of the needs to increase expenditures per pupil. In that context, it's absolutely essential, right, that we work together with countries in order to protect public budgets, make them more efficient, but try to, as much as we can, reallocate budgets towards investing in people, right, which is absolutely critical in this context. Let me stop there.
Thank you for that and for highlighting the risk around the inequalities that predate the pandemic. Nada, if we could turn to you for a second question and just sort of reflecting a little bit on the inequality risks, and what ideas do you have around how we can ensure that no one is left behind? And we've seen some really interesting, innovative and alternative approaches to education in the context of COVID-19. And do you think that this is driving new approaches which can help address the challenge of not leaving anyone behind?
Thanks very much, Dominic. We've heard many good ideas already from several of the panelists, but let me reiterate, of course, we're all working towards sustainable development goal number 4, this very big aspiration, inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for all by 2030. The data is grim. We know that we were not on track, not on target, not nearly going to achieve it, we've just heard. But now the figures are going to worsen exponentially. And thanks to COVID-19, in addition to what we've learned, 191 states have already adopted school closures affecting more than 1.5 billion learners. So just the scale, I think, has been really remarkably overwhelming. And yet we know that there have been many efforts by governments, by education actors at different community levels throughout the various stages of this pandemic to try to improvise, to think about innovative solutions that may have been previously considered too difficult or impossible even. As Gita said, I think implicitly and hopefully now more consciously, there is a huge recognition that we cannot stay with the same thinking about educational interventions. They do have to be rethought, they do have to be reshaped, and I think that's critical. So maybe some examples. I mean, where there is limited connectivity, many member states have used distance learning, mixing educational TV, radio programming, distribution of printed material. A specific example from Sudan, where again they embarked on working with textbook authors and teachers to prepare assignments that will be disseminated through local newspapers. I mean, these models have to be adapted to the local conditions, whatever they are, and I think it's not a cookie cutter approach, whatever we've said. And another example, children with disabilities enrolled in Jordan, for example, in the Azraq and Za'atari refugee camps. They've been using transparent masks so that deaf children can still lip read. I mean, I think we just have to overcome that kind of exclusion that happens very unconsciously. So inclusion is really at the heart of what we're going to advocate. The UN is guided by our framework, the 4 A's: availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. Sounds like a mouthful, but actually, you know, they're all really good concepts. We're a fan of acronyms and things like that. But we also know what works to keep children in school, and some of these conditions and some of the preventative measures should really be removed, regardless of status or citizenship. This is really important. Everyone should benefit, for example, from school feeding or food vouchers or the distance learning devices. And then to really ensure that no one is left behind, then we need to think about the rest of the thing. It's not just about getting school. We've heard already from Jaime, and you know, we know that it's about skills for the longer term, staying in school, but then for what? For employability. I mean, we need to be able to guarantee this trajectory that will ensure the integration. Let's make sure that teachers have the professional skills and the readiness, the ability to cope with crises. A lot of them don't have the materials, they don't have the training. We've got to invest in re-skilling them also. Definitions of the right to education must now include connectivity, including really a priority of the most accessible tools, low or no tech in distance learning. Otherwise you are, again, compounding and I think finally alternative forms of education, including understanding bridges between formal and informal, all of course evidence-based, using data and understanding how we can monitor learning, not just the acquisition of knowledge more generally, much better than we have done. Thank you, I'll stop there.
Thank you. No, there's some really excellent examples there. The transparent masks is a brilliant example of innovation happening in real time. Hassan, if we could turn to you, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic has affected national economies and the job market in many different ways. And I'm really interested to hear how at Qatar University you're ensuring that programs are connecting directly with what the job market and what the country needs, and if you're adapting as things are unfolding.
Thanks, Dominic. I think before I answer this question, if I just may comment on what Nada and Obaking mentioned. I think it is vital for those who are with less opportunity to access for quality education to I think benefit from the new technologies in a way that, for example, such international initiatives for education, such as Education Above All, in partnering with the UNESCO and other international initiatives, can also partner with other initiatives like edX or Coursera's, platforms and others, to have accessibility with less cost and with a massive opportunity for our young generations who are in who lives in refugee camps and other remote areas. I think with the advancement in technology, this is a great opportunity, and it is possible to be conducted, and not only to reach 1 million or 10 millions, but also more and more refugees across the world. Coming back to your question, Dominic, I think the role of the university is always to bring knowledge, to explore, to discovery, and to be a driving force for socio-economic development, and to be a catalyst for all of this. And I think I think generations, for example, in the States, in the United States, maybe for 2 generations, families, have evidences or believe that, post-secondary education is a must. But with this new also advancement with the 4th Industrial Revolution, we see that, where skills, competencies also becoming, more important than sometimes knowledge itself in the field. And we've seen the act that has been signed by, for example, by the President of the United States lately, where academic degrees is not a requirement anymore, rather than skills and competencies. However, for us for example, here at Qatar University, I think to have a balance between competencies, skills, and others, important, and as well as knowledge, I think we are trying to come up with a framework that is learner-centric, research-informed, experiential, entrepreneurial, digitally enriched, and competency-based at the same time. So by having these 6 criteria, I think it is possible to provide the community, to provide the society with those who are lifelong learners, who have the soft skills, as well as they have the knowledge, as well as the dynamic to change, their needs if the work environment has changed due to all of these advancements in technology.
Right, thank you, Dr. Hassan. Geeta, what do you feel that global leaders and education systems need to do more of to prevent children being left unable to read and write? And is there an opportunity within the current crisis to drive through new kinds of thinking around that?
Absolutely. We heard from Jaime, from Nava, about the importance of learning, specifically investing in proven methods for learning, committing that every child has the following: quality learning materials, trained teachers with ongoing coaching, supportive environments. Can we turn around this illiteracy gap? I would say if we don't believe we can, what are all of us doing here? We absolutely know that there are solutions, but ultimately they can only be implemented if we remove political and technical barriers, increase social and political will. And Rincha Reed would argue we also need to focus on clear operational specifics to ensure change, budgetary implementation specifics. We've always said that a world free of childhood illiteracy is possible. We know illiteracy is a solvable problem, and our research shows that by the end of grade 2, children on our programs are reading 2 to 3 times faster with 87% greater comprehension than their peers. We know that we can decrease dropout rates for girls significantly with life skills training and mentorship. So yes, we can turn this around, by no means alone. Many of us have talked about partnership and the importance of strategic partnership to achieve Sustainable Development Goals. So we obviously believe in what's possible, and having worked at an organization that's majority privately funded, that's reached 20 million children with our programs in the last 2 decades, we've seen firsthand students who've emerged from our programs being recognized and making tangible differences in their communities. Just yesterday, I learned of Sugisma, a 3rd grader from Nepal, who was awarded the Best Reader in Nepal award by the Ministry of Education. She set a record of checking out 296 books from her school library. Or we can look at Dung from Vietnam, a young woman who's now a business owner, supporting girls with scholarships in her own community. After graduating from our programs, she met the former First Lady, Michelle Obama, last December to share her journey. Or another example, Sapna, a Room to Read program participant who's now a nurse in Nepal fighting COVID-19 to keep her community safe and healthy. So we're incredibly passionate about our mission of ending illiteracy because we know it's possible. We know what needs to happen to make that goal possible. And fighting this particular challenge will mitigate the challenges caused by a lot of other social problems, because these children become the community leaders prepared to take on complex issues like the climate crisis or future pandemics. So we cannot just say 24 million children may not go back to school because of pandemic and abandon them. We cannot forget the 250 million children that were already not learning the basics. This is not going to serve this world well. We have no choice but to act and make sure that we turn this learning crisis around.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think the point you made about the or the example you gave of the community activist in Vietnam is a really interesting one, and it also connects with a question that's come through from the audience on YouTube. And this is a question specifically directed at Mamadou and Obakan. So Mamadou, if we could start with you, and then we'd love to hear from Obakan about how can non-policymakers, so here it's clarified as normal citizens and parents, help improve our new education systems and prepare children for this new normal? Are you seeing examples of real actionable everyday steps in the communities with which you work that people can take? So Mamadou, to you first, and then to Obakan, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dominic. Yes, there are several ways for citizens and members of the larger community to really contribute. Again, it's about the refugees, children who are part of the communities. How do you receive them? How do you protect them? How do you make them feel welcomed in the community? Because they have gone through trauma, but they are resilient and they can contribute. They can contribute, and we have just heard a few examples now. And you know, in the report you refer to, we have the refugee from DRC trained in Rwanda, benefiting from a scholarship, the Daffy scholarship, and as a medical doctor contributing to fighting the pandemic. We have the refugee teachers from South Sudan in Gambela area of Ethiopia. We have some of the refugee children from Syria who have the highest marks into accessing university. So we have refugees and they can give back. So there are ways for individuals to contribute. They can speak with their lawmakers, they can speak with the communities, and they can greatly really contribute. So if I may start with that and maybe just add a bit about you know, the resilience of the refugees themselves. They are resilient, they can contribute, and youth in general are resilient. And we have seen it happening as part of the response to the pandemic. That agility, adaptability to the new normal, which is a combination or a mixture of in-person as well as digital learning. This is really the, I think, the new normal, at least for a year or two. How can we make sure that for refugee communities, for example, there are adequate wash facilities? How can we make sure that the very good progress that has been made for refugee girls and adolescents in particular is really sustained and scaled up to the level that is needed. Because with the Malala Fund, we did some studies and some projections. Learning from Ebola in West Africa, for example, we found that if we do not take very bold measures, 50% of the girls, adolescent girls who are now attending secondary education will not access it, and they will just lose opportunities of going back to school. So that Build Back Better is really, I think, an opportunity for us to really address these issues. Over to you, Dominic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mamadou. I mean, Obaken, can I bring you in on the same question as it was also directed to you, please?
Yeah, I think I'll just first start off by saying that I like to say to people that power is where you stand, and justice is what you can deliver. So we all find ourselves in very different situations. Therefore, we can do very, very different things. But I'll just first like to give an example where parents insisted that school teachers be paid on time, and how that ended up ultimately improved the level of motivation and the level of spirit that teachers come to school with. Therefore, meaning that often those teachers were more than willing to stay above class hours to be able to ensure that students understand the content that they've consumed, only precisely from something that we often take for granted, being paid on time. Second is the idea of shelter, food and security. If you can adopt a child into your home, if you have that luxury, please do so. Thirdly is around sanitation pads for girls. I often think that we really, really underplay the importance of girls having access to free sanitation pads, particularly in very rural and very, very remote areas, because often that is one of the reasons why a lot of them miss out on schools, miss out on being able to go to school. So if you can literally provide any of those things where government often either takes too long to be able to deliver on that promise, or B, it's just very limited in capacity. So I'll just once again repeat that I think power is where you stand, and justice is what you can deliver. So look within where you are and look within what you have. It's never too small or too big, and just give back from that. And yeah.
Brilliant. That's an example of parental direct action to ensure teachers are paid on time is fantastic. Jaime, in your opening, you talked about the critical role that parents will play in finding a way out of this education crisis. It's a really interesting and very practical question that's come through for you on Teams. What changes have you seen countries or education systems make over the last 6 months that you believe we need to see more of?
Well, let me then dwell a little bit more on what was mentioned. One is in terms of changes, I do see a recognition of parents, and I think the points that the examples that Obaken was mentioning were very good, right? It's sometimes we're worried about the very simple things, right? But if you do have parents that really have a sense of belonging to the education community, right, that improve the quality of the education service dramatically, right? Because I mean, and that was a very great example. But in terms of moving forward, I think that's going to be critical in this continuum of the education process, right? In order to make the whole system much more resilient, the role of the community and the role of parents in particular is each time more important, both in terms of giving the right conditions to their own children, but also in order to in a partnership with the teacher, and in terms of having a better understanding of what are the needs of children. So in a way, this will allow us to make us a more child-centered education process, right? In which you have community, school, principal, teacher, parent, right? Thinking in which way we're working together for the benefit of the child. So it's sometimes we see in some instances the parents who might be thinking, okay, so I made this effort in order to make sure that that my daughter is going to school. Now it's the job of the school. No, it's never the job only of the school, right? It's a partnership between school, community, and the family. And then the other change that I do see is that teachers have created in many countries, right? We do see that teachers have made an immense effort to maintain the communication with their students. It has been very difficult, right? And in no countries we have seen that the use of multi-platform remote learning strategies, in which in some cases you use online, but many kids will not be able to reach that. But many kids can have access through a phone, through a smartphone, and you have radio and you have TV. I would say that TV and radio are back, right, in terms of the education process, right? Something that we had put in the dustbin, but now they're back, and we have seen very creative combinations of teachers using the material that is broadcasted through TV and radio, but then complementing that, providing orientation through WhatsApp and checking through WhatsApp or other social media if their kids are making progress or not. In a way, I see incredibly, but some of these social media instruments have been much more equalizing, right, than many other interventions. I mean, WhatsApp is much more equalizing now than access to internet, right? But a lot of that has been because of creativity of schools and teachers. They have put a lot of effort to find new ways, right, to try to maintain the contact of children with the school. And let me close saying that in a way proves that the future that we have been talking about using much more technology is coming to the present, right? And the things that a teacher will say, no, I just can't learn those techniques. I can't learn those technologies. Some of them who have had the chance have been able to learn them much faster than they had ever thought they will. So I think this is proving us that change is possible much faster than we had envisioned in the past.
Yeah, I would agree completely with that. I think it's been a really interesting revelation during the last 6 months at how quickly education can adapt. Geeta, are you going to come in on this as well, please?
Yeah, I just wanted to give an example from our work that reiterates what Jaime and Obaking were just saying. We have seen in our work in Rwanda, for example, that parents who believe they have the right to expect their child to learn no matter what will turn on the radio for our radio lessons, versus those who think that learning is isolated within the realm of the school and the responsibility of the teacher. They will not turn on that radio. And so the education community needs to keep thinking about how to involve parents in meaningful ways and support them. And as we talk about that continuum, we need to be looking at how to strengthen the out-of-school learning systems, home-based learning, offline and online, employment-based learning, youth group-based learning, sports, music groups. I mean, the whole range, the whole ecosystem of learning that exists outside of the school. This is the moment that we can learn how to best utilize them and make for a more resilient education system overall.
Yeah, that's so important, isn't it? I think, and really good examples about the role of community or the importance of parents in supporting education. There's a really interesting question for Nada that's come through on Microsoft Teams, which takes a different perspective and thinking about the role of international law. The question is from Dean Ahmed Dalal, and I'm going to read it out verbatim, if that's okay. So Dean Dalal says, although international law is not a panacea for all contemporary problems, it provides potentially powerful tools that might contribute to better protection of the right to education. So Nada, are there international legal mechanisms that are relevant for and applicable in the situation of a global pandemic that disrupts education and compounds inequalities between rich and poor societies, and that can defend the rights for those who don't have the resources to protect their rights? So specifically, it's a rather long question, sorry. What legal tools are there that can be leveraged to protect the right to education during this crisis?
So obviously we have, I think, many international statutes at national level. I mean, I think what we try to do in this area of the law is close two gaps. Where we have international standards, we try to make national legislation that really honors the values that are enshrined, and then we try to help countries implement those national norms and make sure that they are actually working. So a lot of the legislation on education is actually done at the national level, where we work with the entire UN system, with the bank, obviously, with our partners, with our data institutions, to make sure that we are capturing, for example, minimum age requirements, the inclusion of women, rules about the inclusion of refugees and migrants, all of those things that are quite often done in order to ensure that there are no big protection gaps. We have the Universal Declaration, of course, on human rights. We have the right to education. We have, again, as I said, the Committee on the Right of the Child, which is just celebrated 30 years, and which has again illustrated where parliaments need to be vigilant, where again we need to really enshrine some of these norms and put them really in the letter of the law at the national level. So yes, multiple entry points at the legal level, and I think the whole point is really to make sure that they don't just stay as laws, but that we really can implement them and give them teeth, which is usually the problem.
Thank you, Nada. Dr. Hassan, a really interesting question for you, and I think one that you'll have some really compelling experiences to share from work within the university around. So we've talked a couple of times already in this conversation about the importance of technology, but also how technology won't replace teachers. We've also talked a little bit about some of the professional skills gap that predate the pandemic, and that teachers weren't, in many contexts, weren't completely familiar or comfortable or had that much opportunity to use technology. Are you, in your institution, have you been able to help teachers? How have you been able to help teachers and professors adapt to the new norms and to using technology to support distance learning or hybrid approaches? And are you seeing other institutions in Qatar or internationally follow similar approaches?
Yes, thank you for this question. I think as we were working in our strategy, and our strategy, we call it a transformation strategy, because it should, adapt to the future of the markets, as well as to the needs of the government and the National Vision 2030 of the state of Qatar. Part of it was to adapt for new modes such as online learning, development and introduction of MOOCs courses and others. And for some of my colleagues, they were hesitant or reluctant whether our faculty, our teachers will be smart enough, or I would say motivated towards this new modes of delivery of courses. And in fact, when the government shut down the teaching approach, which is the normal one, and closure of the university as well as the schools, and to move towards online, we were able to shift within a couple of days. We found out that our faculty were very motivated, very enthusiastic to adapt for this new technique, for this new mode of delivering of courses. And in fact, we were really surprised that we were able to train them, to train those who were not or did not have the experience before. Within only 2 or 3 days, we were able to train about 600 to 800 of our faculties. And within less than 1 week, all of our platforms, as well as the IT support, were able to overcome all the technical difficulties that we have faced at the beginning, and it works fine. I'm not saying that what we have done was the best approach or the model for online learning, but what I was saying is what I could say, it is a remedy of preserving the educational experience for our students, and to save the academic year and the semester for them. So I think, once we give the opportunity for our faculty, they will prove that they can do it, the teacher can do it, as well as in collaboration with the students. We were also lucky because we are talking here about the higher education, where our students are mature enough to adapt for these techniques and to communicate well with our teachers and faculties. It is more difficult for the general education K to 12 to adapt for these new techniques because of how the behavior of the students and the children with their teachers, how to control the environment, and how to make sure that they are delivering the right materials in the right time, and how the parents can follow up. Our students are more independent than those who are in K to 12 phase.
Thank you. And your point about creating the opportunity for educators to deploy new skills is really well made. We've had a couple of questions that have come in asking for quite specific advice from different experts on the panel. So there's a question for Geeta that I'm going to come to first, and then a question for Obukang. So this is a question that's come through MS Teams, Geeta, and there's two parts to it. First part is, in your experience, how does your approach at Room to Read's how does your Room to Read approach differ in terms of tackling women's education in different parts of the world? And then secondly, the second part of it is, what advice do you have to give organizations that aim to impact and improve education opportunities for women around the world?
Thank you, Dominic. In terms of difference, so Room to Read has a few differentiating factors that I think allows us to one, comprehensively support young women as they complete secondary school, as well as to act quickly in situations like we find ourselves in right now with the pandemic. One is that we are majority privately funded. That does not mean that we do not have very large partnerships with bilateral and multilateral agencies around technical expertise and operational expertise, but we do have a level of nimbleness that allows us to innovate on our programming in very quick learning cycles that I think has allowed us to grow our programming in a way that delivers impact that is measurable. In terms of advice, the way that we operate is something that I would encourage those who are interested to look at, our operational model. We are a 1,600 person organization. The large majority of the staff in the countries where we operate, local nationals, all the way through to country leadership. And the country leadership of our countries of operation are senior experts in their fields in areas of gender equality as well as literacy work. They work directly with the government to help localize our programs, contextualize. Many of the learnings in our global frameworks come from the countries in which we operate. And so the Girls Education Program particularly evolved over the 20 years that we have been operating from one that was initially a scholarship-based model based on need, but ultimately turned into a school-based approach that allows cohorts of girls to go through the program together over a period of time that ultimately helps institutionalize attitudes around gender within the community. So I'll stop there, but it gives you a sense of some of the things that I would look at.
Thank you for that. And Obukang, a question that was specifically for you about advice you would give to policymakers to help them support youth initiatives or youth activists.
Yeah, so I think I'll first start off by just saying that often I think what like young people who are like running initiatives or like organizations need is on different levels. But I would start with saying guidance in terms of how do they scale up impact, how do they measure impact, so that if you do end up applying for funding, it's a lot easier to be able to get that funding. Because often what we find is that most of the ways in which we set up our like organizations, we think in a very small way. We think if I can just maybe help people on my street, I will be done. And then you just then start to do that, you get too passionate, and now you want to take it on a country level, and you go to a multinational and ask for funding, and they ask you, do you have a pilot where you have done something of a similar nature? and where like has it worked? What did you learn from it that you're going to do differently in the next course? So I think I think it's important that almost every single multinational operating in every single country set up programs to be able to support young people to be able to build to the scale at which they can possibly be collaborators in the future. So you're not just giving us funding, but we have a space where we say that we can work together in that same space. So also to just not limit youth-like organizations to just being youth forever, because we are young people who are growing up and we're not going to be young people forever. So we are looking to be collaborators rather than just young activists or like young collaborators. And personally, I'm not a big fan of the word young like activist, because it just like implies that, I mean, I'm young before I'm an activist, and I'm an activist before I'm young.
It's very well made. Mamadou, if we could come to you now, please. It's a broad, general question, but I would love to get your thoughts on it around how can we use this crisis to ensure that investment in education increases rather than decreases. And it would then be interesting to bring Jaime in on the same topic, if that's okay. But Mamadou, with you first, please.
Thank you. I think that the crisis has taught us how we should be relying on each other. It is teaching us how the human capital is important for each one of our societies, and people who were deemed to be excluded, we see the importance of themselves being included, the importance of nurses, teachers, and community leaders, etc. So I think this crisis really offers us opportunities that we did not have before. And this requires, I think, additional investment. And additional investment is not only, it's financial, but it's not only financial. It's also the right policies. Very often we did not have the smart policies that are required. You asked Nada a question about international law. In 1951, in the Refugee Convention, states who are party to that convention stated that refugee children will have access to education as the nationals. This is the commitment that they made. But when it comes to domesticating that international law, this is where we start seeing the disparities, and this is where we start seeing some of the policies that are not smart and that are costly. So the investment, I should say, is financial, but it's also investment into the human beings, but also in a very, at the policy level. And if I can just use this opportunity to say that, we should also not look at education in isolation. Education, I think, should be linked with the livelihoods of the families, of the teachers, of the communities that are often, when it comes to refugees and their host, some of the, the farthest left behind. So how can we make sure that, again, coming to the right policies, we make sure that education is not seen in isolation. So these are just few reflections I would offer. I think what Gita, Nada, Obakeng said is possible. It is possible to reach the level we want to reach to, but sometimes we believe that it is mostly in financial terms, but I don't think that it is only in financial terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Mamadou. And Jaime, I'd love to get your thoughts on that same question before we move to invite you all for closing remarks.
Let me complement actually what Mamadou just said, which is he's absolutely right. Financing is critical, but it's only one part of the equation. So we need to have several conditions for a successful education reform, and in this case, for a successful countries go into this accelerated path that is needed in order to provide the right education to everyone. And it is the money, true, but it is having first the right policies, having the right technical designs. But I would say that even sometimes that is the easy part, right? I mean, we, to a certain extent, we know how a good school is run, right? And we know what to do in order to give teachers the right conditions in order to develop us as great professionals. It's really not rocket science. So a lot is not only the technical design, but it's the political commitment and it's the social commitment with education, right? So you need all of those, right? You need the money, yes. You need the right policies, yes. But you need to put the political commitment. Why the political commitment is needed? First, because you need to have continuity in terms of reforms, and second, because also a lot is needed in education in terms of management capacity. It's not only the money, it's not only the having the right design of the policy. You need to implement the policies, and policy implementation implies having the right quality of bureaucracy in education systems. Right? Sometimes we say how much the society can do, how much families can do. Yes, they can do a lot, but to have a well-run education system, you need a public sector that can either provide the system or regulate the system, and that's not easy, right? And so you need to have that political commitment implies also putting the right management capacity, the right quality of bureaucracy to run an extremely complex system like is education. And finally, one thing that I want to say that is another prerequisite of this list that Mamadou was saying is that we need to take politics out of education, right? In the sense that a huge problem that we have in many countries, for instance, regarding teachers, is that teachers might not be appointed or promoted, right, because of meritocracy or because of their talents and capacity and efforts, but may be promoted or selected as teachers in a place or as principals because of political issues. If you have that, you will have a system that does not work. You need to take politics out, right, and have all decisions within the education system as technical decisions. But taking politics out is a political decision, right? That is really a political decision. So you need to have all those requisites. You need the money, yes. You need the right policies, yes. You need the political commitment. You need the right quality of bureaucracy. And many of those are political decisions, true. But that is what we need to do in order to implement those policies that, as I was saying, there are really, in many cases, things that we know how to do. It's just a matter to make sure that we do them at the right scale, right? Because let me close with that. I love the phrase that Nara was using. Yes, education is a right, but it's an enabling right, right? That allows us to then conquer many of the other rights.
Thank you for that, which is exactly why it should transcend politics, isn't it? Thank you all so much for your fantastic insights and comments and for sharing your brilliance and your time with us today. We're really close to the end. Before we close, in many parts of the world, we're at the start of the new academic year, and I would love to turn to each of you, and we'll start with Nada and then go to Hassan. Turn to each of you for your remarks or suggestions or words of encouragement or advice for students, teachers, educators, parents who are watching the webinar live or watching the recording later as they embark on a new academic year at this very strange moment in history. So Nada, if we could begin with you, please.
Thanks very much again, and thank you to everyone who is with us. I want to end with a word of encouragement, I think, to all those frontline workers, in this case, not just the health workers, but really the education professionals and the parents who have become education professionals over these months, and the students. Returning to school is normally a time of excitement, it's a time of renewal, it's a time of great hope. And this time round, it's been tinged with so much uncertainty, with so much fear. I think we want to urge everybody to stay optimistic, to continue to innovate together, as we have heard all the many examples, and to be resourceful, to remain agile in this quest for knowledge, which is so noble. We're all working hard to help, and I think you must all be inspired by Obakeng's energy and dedication, because I think that is a model for the future, and he is one of many I know. So good luck, and we were remaining vigilant by your side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hassan, if we could come to you, please.
Yes, I just want also to echo what Nada has just mentioned. I think it is for the first time since the Second World War that the whole world faces such a crisis that touches every country, every region, every household, and I think it is very essential for the governments to work hand in hand with the civil societies, with the families, the parents, the individuals to pass over such crises. And I think if we have such collaboration between these different levels of our societies, I think we will pass through this crisis. It is very essential that our parents work hand in hand with the schools as well as with the university, and academicians, to make sure that we will all go through this in a peaceful mind, as well as very successfully and learning experience that will enrich our experience over time.
Thank you, Hassan. And Mamadou, if we could come to you now, please.
Thank you, Dominic. I think to the students and youth who are watching us, COVID has shown us how important you are, we all are, the frontliners, the teachers, the doctors. We need to invest into education. Only if we are able to invest in education are we going to safeguard the next generation. And I just want to say to you that when you are thinking of the next generation, yes, it is yourself, it is your neighbors, but it's also the refugees, it is the stateless persons. So please make sure that the inequalities that we had prior COVID do not continue. The exclusion that we had prior COVID do not continue. I think we have the possibility of building back better, and with the right and the smart policy, I'm certain that we will have that next generation of teachers, doctors, as well as engineers secured. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Geeta, your closing thoughts or advice?
Interestingly, Room to Read recently, for both International Literacy Day and Back to School, asked our supporters to share their messages for students, and we received so many thoughtful responses, so I thought I'd share one of them. It said, "You have the opportunity to make a difference in your life, for your family, and for your community. You can do it. You're not alone. We are all with you." And that's the message I want to share with students, teachers, educators, parents, who keep fighting for their children to continue learning. You're not alone. There's a global community supporting you, people like us all over the world committed to your children learning.
Brilliant, very much. So, Jaime, come to you, and then we're going for the final word.
Yeah, I would just say,
let me complement what my colleagues have said. As Hassan was saying, this is the worst crisis in education of the last century. We have never lived something like this, but we cannot waste the opportunity that this crisis is giving us. Even I would share what Nada was saying. What Nada was saying, that we need to be agile, we need to be resilient, we need to be optimistic. But I would add to that list a sense of urgency. Right? Given the huge risks that we have of wasting a generation, of losing a generation, right? We need to make sure that that does not happen. So there's a sense of urgency of putting the right political, financial, managerial commitment on education. Because today is also the time of innovation, right? The fact that if we play on the lessons that we have for parents, for teachers, for education systems, and we build on those lessons, then we can bring that school of the future that we have sometimes thought that will come in 10 years or so. Bring that school of the future that is more equitable, that really cares about the marginalized, like Mamadou was saying in the case of refugees, that it's more, that in addition to being equitable, is more impactful, more resilient. We have the opportunity to do it. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, thank you. And Obakang, final words.
Yeah, I will just say that every single day, ask yourself what you're doing to make someone else's life easier, because I think if one person helps another person, that is the best way to make sure that no one falls behind. And at the end of the pandemic, we're gonna just see the triumph of the human spirit, just like against adversity, because we would have each done something for someone else.
Easy, powerful message to finish on. Thank you. So thank you so much to all of the experts and contributors and speakers today for sharing of your time and your wisdom. That concludes this edition of the Education City Speaker Series, and I hope that you'll all agree that we've had some absolutely fascinating insights into the way forward for education from so many different perspectives. Thank you again to all of our speakers for everything that they've brought to this discussion, and thank you to all of you, wherever you are in the world, for being part of this event. If this has left you wanting to find out more about the Education City Speaker Series and about Qatar Foundation, then please visit www.qf.org.qa, and the full discussion will shortly be uploaded on Qatar Foundation's YouTube page. And in the meantime, on behalf of all of us, goodbye and stay safe.